This presentation is on ACCA P5 Advanced Performance Management. What I'll be going through in this presentation is just briefly what is P5 and more importantly what it is not, just some of the required or assumed knowledge that you'd need to bring forward from your previous studies, a quick little outline of some of the main areas on the syllabus, and then just two sample questions, just look at the content of them, just give you an idea of the type of things you will be asked. So first of all, what is P5? Really the most important thing to be said is it is not an advanced version of F5. It takes a little bit from it, we'll talk about that in a moment. But it does use some of the tools and techniques that you should be familiar with from F5. It's not a particularly technical paper. There are calculations on the paper, but they're usually fairly straightforward and quite quick to do. Primarily, about 70% of the marks on a P5 paper come from analysis and application, with only the balance of about 30% maximum coming from calculations. So it really is a paper where calculations are the smaller part of it. Now, just where it sits in the grand scheme of things in ACCA, it is, as I said, it comes from F5 and it's called Advanced Performance Management, but only takes part of F5, but it also takes a lot from P3, primarily some of the models. Now, the examiner assumes full knowledge of F5, that's what he says, but really that's just a sort of a get-out clause in case he asks anything in particular that comes from F5 that you're meant to know. So I said it's not really an advanced F5, but it uses some of these sort of tools and techniques that you will have come across at F5. You're not really required to be an expert in management accounting, but you are expected to be aware of some of these sort of tools and techniques, specifically things like sort of activity-based costing, variances. Now, variances, you won't be asked to calculate variances, but just we may be given some variance and asked to include it in some of your analysis, even a little bit of CVP or break-even analysis. Just as an example, a number of years ago there was an ABC question which asked you for 15 marks to evaluate the move from an organisation's current method of costing, which happened to be absorption costing, to ABC. Now, the calculations of that were quite straightforward. It was a 15-mark question, but only about 4.5 to 5 marks were for the calculations. The other 10 marks or so were for your analysis of what it would mean for the company, what extra information it gave to the company, and how it would help them implement their strategy with this increased information. Now, as I mentioned before, there is a slight overlap with the P3 syllabus. Really what it is a number of the models you'd have come across in P3 will be using again in P5, but much more in terms of application of the models rather than actually having to describe the models. About sort of setting strategy and setting the future direction of an organisation. In P5, what we're looking at is measuring the implementation or the impact of that strategy in an organisation. So looking at, are we implementing it correctly, are we performing well, and how can we actually improve performance? So we've mentioned a little bit about what P5 is not, but what actually is it? Now, it's performance management, not performance measurement. Measurement is actually just measuring performance. Are we hitting our targets? Performance measurement encompasses performance measurement, but also includes things like, are we using the correct information, or have we got the correct information and appropriate information? So we'll be looking at, we might be presented with a number of performance reports and we're asked to assess those reports. Are they actually appropriate for the job? We'll be looking at, are we measuring the right things? So it's not just about calculating KPIs and measures, is to ensure that we're actually measuring the right things. What we're trying to measure is the implementation of strategy. Do our measures allow us to measure that? We have to look at things like, are the measures correctly constructed, particularly around things like dysfunctional behaviour. When we measure something, people tend to behave in certain ways, and we need to ensure that the measures are correctly constructed. And also we're trying to ensure that all the organisation's resources are being used and managed effectively. Just a couple of items that are on the syllabus, a couple of the main items. First area is around the effects on performance management systems. So we need to be aware of the things, internal and external, that will actually impact on our performance. Some of the stuff you'll come across in F5, we'll be looking at things like, some basic costing, absorption, ABC, even a little bit of pricing. So we have got the right kind of information. We need to look at what we call the environmental impacts, which is quite a large part of P5. So you look at the external factors on an organisation, things like levels of risk, levels of competition, be looking at models like pests, even a SWOT, Porter's 5 forces, that type of stuff. We also have to be aware of the internal impacts on an organisation in terms like the corporate structure. Is it a functional structure, a divisional structure? Looking at the ethics, and particularly things like the stakeholders, coming across at things like stakeholder analysis. And finally, we'll be looking at things like information. So have we got the right information? Is it at the right level? We'll be looking at strategic, tactical and operational information. Okay, is around actually performance systems themselves. So we'll have had the right information and understand the environment we're operating in. Now we're looking at the actual performance itself. So we're looking at things like setting the correct performance measures. So looking at what to measure. What are the appropriate measures? Then looking at a number of different sort of KPIs or performance measures, both financial and non-financial. Now the non-financial performance is very important on P5. And also, as mentioned before, in terms of behaviour, we need to ensure that we're actually measuring the right things and motivating people in the right way. Thirdly, we'll be looking at assessing performance systems themselves. So we might have the measures in place, we may have a performance system in place, and we want to ensure that's correctly constructed. Now there are 4 models, important models on the P5 syllabus that tends to be on most papers. You get asked at least one of these. Things like the balanced scorecard and the building blocks model, which you come across at the F5 level. Then additional ones, the performance prism and the performance pyramid. Now all these models do primarily the same thing. They help us to measure performance. They also help us to assess the performance measures. Have we got the correct mix of financial and non-financial long and short-term measures? And they also help us to improve performance management systems. So we might use these models if we're asked to measure performance or if we're asked to assess the performance system itself. Now, there's a part at the end of the syllabus around what is called sort of current or recent developments. Looking at things like quality, TQM, JIT, Kaizen, costing, Six Sigma, number of quality systems we can use to help us improve performance, corporate failure, looking at a couple of models, and then areas like environmental management accounting. Now the exam itself, like all the other P level exams, particularly the options, 3-hour exam with 15 minutes to read. I mentioned before, it is primarily a non-computational paper, so about 70% of the marks will feature discussion and analysis. Split into 2 parts. Section A just has 1 compulsory question for 50 marks. Now, usually in that question, you've got 1.5 pages to 2 pages of a case study with a number of appendices, and you'll be asked 4 or 5, up to 7 different sort of sub-questions on it. It'll cover a number of items. It won't be just on one part of the syllabus. Then Section B, you've got to do 2 from 3, 25 marks each for the other 50 marks. Usually in these option questions, it'll be primarily on one topic, but usually we'll cover another topic in it as well. It's an application paper as mentioned before, so you need to apply the techniques and knowledge. And you're primarily asked to assess, evaluate and advise. So you'll be given a set of information and you're asked to assess it, to advise management on what to do, or to analyse a particular scenario. There tends not to be large numerical calculations. When we have calculations on a P5 paper, it's generally at the start of a question, and what it's doing is giving us information we can use to aid us in analysing the actual scenario. So it's all about adding value to the information that was actually provided in a question. Option question in particular on P5 would first of all ask you to maybe describe very briefly a particular technique or model. But then the majority of the marks would be for, first of all, applying that model to the specific scenario or to the case study, and then using the output from that analysis and from that model. So how does it help us to analyse the situation, or how can we use that information to improve the current system? Now just briefly look at 2 small past questions, just to give you an idea of the type of things you might be asked. First of all, the June 2011 question 3 was an option question. And it asks us, first of all, to briefly describe Fitzgerald and Moon's building block model of performance management. And it was only 4 marks out of the total marks available for the question, but a specific piece of knowledge was required. If you weren't aware of the model, you couldn't answer the question at all. But then you're asked to, first of all, evaluate the existing performance management system by applying the building blocks model. So take that model and apply it to the particular scenario. So it feeds on and then feeds on to part C of the question, which asks you to do 2 things. First of all, explain the main improvements the introduction of a building block approach to performance management could provide. So the general kind of improvements we'd get by using this model. And then secondly, to suggest specific improvements to the existing system of performance measured at APX that would have been highlighted by the use of this model. So again, you need to be aware of the model, apply it to provide information, and then use that information to try and improve a system or actually improve performance. And just finally, the 2003 question 1, which was one of our 50 mark questions, compulsory, where you're always asked to write a report for and you're given 4 professional marks for that. Then in this case we're asked to do 5 different sort of sub-questions. First of all, we're asked to explain the characteristics that differentiate services businesses from manufacturing ones. This is a very specific piece of information that's required, but again you're asked using Kolmog, or the company in this question, to illustrate your points. So again, rather than just regurgitating information, you're asked to apply it to this scenario. Then second of all, you're asked to evaluate the current strategic performance report. So we're given a report in the form of information, and you're asked to evaluate it, to evaluate that report, and also evaluate the choice of performance metrics used in the appendix. So again, asked to do 2 things. Then third of all, you're asked to evaluate the outline balance scorecard at Kolmog, suggesting suitable improvements. So in a lot of these requirements, you're asked to do 2 things. You're asked to evaluate the outline balance scorecard. So we look at their scorecard they've come up with, and we're asked to evaluate it. But then based on that evaluation, come up with improvements to it. So again, as in the previous question, if you're unaware of the balanced scorecard, what it's used for, it makes it difficult to answer the question. Then in the 4th section, you're asked to describe the difficulties in implementing and using the balanced scorecard, usually around behaviour. So the behavioural problems in implementing a new system, you're being asked again specifically in this organisation, what might be the difficulties. And then finally, for 14 marks, a lot of marks for the last part of the question, you're asked again to carry out a number of tasks. Firstly, explain the purpose of setting targets which are challenging, and then evaluate those standards and rewards, okay, for the hotel manager's performance reward system as requested by the CEO. So you're asked to do 2 things. Why did we have to set targets which are challenging? And then evaluate the standards and rewards that are given in the question, but specifically as requested by the CEO. So within the scenario, the CEO will have mentioned something that he wants you to do, and you have to actually carry it out. So we've seen from those 2 questions, there's no huge in-depth knowledge required on any particular topic, but without that sort of basic information or basic knowledge, you won't be able to attempt the questions. An option, a couple of ideas of things you might want to think about. First of all, if you print out the last couple of papers for each option you're actually looking at, it just gives you an idea of the type of content that's been covered, the type of questions being asked. People always talk about pass rates, usually something you should really ignore. At the P level, the option papers, they're all much of a muchness in terms of actual pass rates. So again, pass rates aren't a great guide. One of the best things you can do is ask around for people who've actually done the papers before and see what they think of them, any things they found particularly difficult or particularly useful. If you have any questions that I haven't covered and you'd like answered, you can email me directly at mick.bristow@accountancyschool.ie, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as I can. Thank you.